Greetings, everyone. We have now entered the seventh lecture of our ongoing series exploring open versus closed systems as far as they pertain to economics, science, culture, and much more. Today's lecture will focus on a certain topic by the name of entropy, which has profound ramifications on the domain of our conception of what humanity is, what economics is, and what the universe at large is designed to be, allow, permit, and our place within said universe. The implications politically over what entropy actually means is immense, which is why today's lecture will be a little bit longer, perhaps. There are many quotes featuring the remarks, the words of people representing either the paradigm of entropy or its opposing school, which presumes that humanity and the universe exhibit properties which are anti-entropic, not entropic. And I'm going to explain and define what all of these terms mean. So this will go on for about 60 slides. And like usual, I will do my best to speak slowly, gradually, for especially people speaking in other languages who need to hear a translation of my voice as I am speaking. Without further ado, let me share my slides. As I mentioned, the title is Entropy, Universal Law, or Political Hoax. One empirical data point to hold in mind, living as we are in the year 2025, there are over 8 billion human lives on this Earth. The Earth, the globe itself, has a certain size, a certain circumference, a certain amount of arable land, a certain quantity of drinkable water. There are unquestionably physical limits to the Earth and to the potential of how many people can be sustained a given quality of existence. No doubt such potentials exist based on certain physical parameters, but some might say that in order to accommodate, to resolve the problem of population, overpopulation, overconsumption, that the solution is to reduce world population levels, to keep them static and small under an enlightened elite. Others who I get along with better believe that there's a more creative solution which could allow for the increased growth and abundance for everyone without necessarily presuming any absolute constraint on how much growth, both quantitative and qualitative, is possible if the world, as we have grown on it, is perhaps not to be expected as our sole limiting factor. Perhaps our home, our ecosystem, might extend far more naturally beyond the limits of the Earth's atmosphere, stratosphere, ionosphere, and perhaps even solar system as a whole. This remains to be seen, but it is based upon certain concepts of how we think of the nature of mind and its resonance with the universe more broadly. Again, this is a population demographic, an estimated demographic chart featuring population growth from 400 BC up into a more recent period, featuring, of course, a couple of moments of stagnation and even a drop in the 14th century, which should not be ignored. The question is, what were the political dynamics, the ideas dominant when said breakdowns happened into what has come to be known in modern times as the Little Dark Age of mass population collapse? So these are always questions to keep in mind, as well as what was humanity doing at times when the populations exploded, our ability to sustain more and higher quality lives increased. Is that a piece of evidence that we are but a cancer or a virus growing and growing at the detriment of nature? Or does that mean that perhaps something correct was being done that we should explore more seriously? The topic, as I mentioned, is entropy, so let's just define that for once. It is sometimes known as the second law of thermodynamics. Wikipedia is a good place to start, defines it as, or describes the state of entropy, saying, in a thermodynamic system, pressure, density, and temperature tend to become uniform over time because the equilibrium state has higher probability, that is, more possible combinations of microstates than any other state. To put some visual assistance to this, all entropic systems, and any system can be conceptualized as entropic, has certain properties. It is number one, the first property is that it is closed. It is all systems that are entropic are by definition closed. They can be understood principally through statistics and probability, but also through a rigid determinism. As the Wikipedia entry alluded to, the end state of all entropic systems is homeostasis, the heat death, as some might say. And here's an example of the transformation of energy before a certain action is taken. Let's say a machine that receives fuel does work afterwards. After a certain repetitive cycle is done, the pistons move, the work is accomplished. There is now less usable energy available. And the more that the machine works, the more it burns fuel, creating all the activities needed to move the pistons to make the machine operate, the less usable energy is available, which will ultimately result in a dead engine, a cold, dead engine devoid of any fuel or ability to carry out work. If we had, let's say, a block of ice brought into a hot chamber, the heat would move towards the cold. That is another factor, an irreversibility of hot moving to cold, creating certain pressure. That's something useful if one approaches it as a machine tool designer. And again, the bottom graph showcases what I just went through again. As free energy decreases over time, the more an operation is in motion, the unusable energy will increase up until the point where the system is effectively dead. So that rigid determinism, even though every single moment to moment, is knowable by mathematical probabilities, the overarching system is rigidly deterministic. As a point of scientific gospel in our modern times, the figure of Sir Arthur Eddington of the Royal Society, the British Royal Society, is useful as an exemplar of the opinion of the British Royal Society's consensus builders over a century ago, where he wrote of entropy in his The Nature of the Physical World, saying that the law that entropy always increases holds, I think, the supreme position among the laws of nature. If someone points out to you that your pet theory of the universe is in disagreement with Maxwell's equations, then so much the worse for Maxwell's equations. If it is found to be contradicted by observation, well, these experimentalists do bungle things sometimes. But if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation. Now, these are some remarks where I would say that this is even absurd, that he's allowing that a scientist coming up with a theory explaining phenomena observable in nature might have a variety of permitted ideas and hypotheses. However, if their hypotheses presume that the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, the idea of heat death, is not to be respected, is not to be involved in their theory or must be discounted, then that theory must a priori be rejected. Well, but what if the theory itself is wrong? What if the universe exhibits properties that demonstrate a higher anti-entropic property? Well, what then? But according to Arthur Eddington, who was knighted for his defense of the status quo, well, that would not be observed. That would not, one would not even be permitted to have such thought crime to perform science if you wish to keep your career. Now, the debate, as I'm going to draw upon it today, between the school that embraces entropy and its opposing school that denies it, I think is exemplified quite well by the, I would say, mortal battle that had occurred between 1714 and 1716 between the figure of the great scientist statesman Gottfried Leibniz, featured on the left, versus the entirety of the Royal Society's Newtonian school, represented by the figure of Isaac Newton, featured there on the right, with an apple falling on his head. The supposed technique used to discover his law of gravitation and so many other great revolutionary laws. Fruit needs to fall on one's head. But it was never simply just against Newton. It's the Newtonians, the entire cult of the English school of empiricism, centered as it was then as today in the British Royal Society and Cambridge. Leibniz had a famous debate at the end of his life through a series of letters written to Samuel Clarke, one of the Rosicrucian Invisible College leaders and handlers of Newton, who played a direct role in compiling, and I would say possibly even on writing much of Newton's Principia Mathematica, which was itself something that attempted to encyclopedize the entire universe, all known laws discovered by human beings. This book by Newton that was published and republished in so many languages and printings over the even 25 years after it was first published, until Newton died in the 1724. It was a codification of everything that had been discovered and attributed to the figure of the great genius Newton. Now, as I had alluded to in previous lectures, when one looks at the origins of many of those discoveries, including that of universal gravitation, the inverse square law, the infinitesimal calculus, or even much of Newton's supposed works on optics, one can find that other scientists long before Newton, sometimes even before Newton had been born, like Johannes Kepler, were actually responsible for making many of those, if not all of those, great discoveries, which were later repackaged and rebranded, devoid of their actual technique of investigation, which one could find when we read the Acta Eruditorum of Leibniz, or the Harmonice Mundi by Kepler, or Huygens's theories on light waves. One could find a method, whereas in the Newtonian school, it is boiled down to a limited array of formulas with certain presumptions about the nature of space and time and matter, which are non-negotiable and unquestionable. I'm going to review a few of those things. Now, this battle was one of paradigms, and Newton, or Clarke, defending the Newtonian school, asserted that Leibniz was wrong. For Leibniz, the universe was animated by reason, by purposefulness, and by goodness. There's other things that I will say about this, but he begins in his first letter to Samuel Clarke saying that Sir Isaac Newton and his followers have also a very odd opinion concerning the work of God. According to their doctrine, God Almighty wants to wind up his watch from time to time. Otherwise, it would cease to move. And he's speaking to the idea of force and space and physics that are portrayed within the Newtonian mechanism, whereby in time there's always less force distributed to permit for useful work to occur, such that as a consequence, in the Newtonian mechanistic system, it is necessary for matter to continue to have mobility, for life to have creativity, that God must go in and correct his error, his badly designed mechanism, by rewinding it as a watchmaker would a watch. Now, Clark cannot deny that that is true, but Clark would say, and does say, that that is perfectly fine because God has no need to be reasonable. That God is so perfect that it is beyond the fallibility of limited human reason. But human reason is so corrupted that we cannot understand by our own design, by our own nature, the irrational necessity of God. God's universe. So I've got two columns here, one featuring Leibniz's universe, the other Newton's universe. There are certain themes that emerge throughout this dispute. In Leibniz's universe, God acts according to reason. God also would never desire arbitrariness, that he couldn't be arbitrary, but that he would never desire it, and thus it wouldn't even come up as something actualized, as an act of arbitrariness. Whereas in Newton's universe, God acts without reason, and thus may and does desire to be arbitrary. In Leibniz's universe, Leibniz defends a God which is capable of and desires perfectibility in creation. And he makes a point that in Newton's universe, God is considered perfect, but as such is incapable of change. It's so perfect that that Newton's idea of God is static. This idea of God is thus incapable of perfectibility, which is a very arrogant, limiting factor humans would impose upon the characteristic of God, to say that God is incapable of perfectibility. Leibniz would say that God is both active throughout creation, but also transcends creation simultaneously. These apparently opposite ideas are actually not in dispute, but as it is called, God is both mundana as well as supramundana. Of the world, within all of creation, there can be no volume of creation anywhere within the universe that could be conceptualized as being separated from God, but also that God is not limited by the creation. So that is different from the Newtonian God, which is completely outside of creation, that we are infinitely separated by God because God created the universe, but is thus incapable of acting within creation itself, is infinitely separated, except on occasion by purely supernatural interventions, as I alluded to, the winding up of a clock periodically. That is fine. That is allowable. But otherwise, no God. Again, in Leibniz's universe, God exhibits the maximum wisdom and love possible. God, also in Leibniz's universe, God's creation is imbued with infinite potential for perfectibility. In Newton's universe, God's will is absolute. And I mentioned this, he may be absurd if he wishes to be. God is effectively a Freudian projection of a human tyrant in the Newtonian universe. Now, Newton was somebody who, we are told, discovered the calculus along with Leibniz. Now, in fact, there's no evidence of this. The evidence shows that Leibniz discovered the calculus, the language needed to explain his system of dynamics, of the physical curvature caused by physical space-time in physical reality. There was an observation that a language capable of describing nonlinear changes, as we see within a catenary, a hanging chain, where every single moment has a different array of tension, of horizontal, vertical force pulling, as well as gravitational force pulling at every infinitesimally small chain within a hanging chain or a bridge. All of the universe features these physical curves, and and a language didn't exist permission that gave us a power to understand or describe that until Leibniz did so and showcased how his mind worked within his uh, published articles in the Acta Eruditorium. Newton never shows anything of the sort, but Newton even ran a commission at the Royal Society, which he moved into the city of London, the city within a city, after the Dutch takeover of England in 1688 and the setup of the Bank of England. Newton ensured that the Royal Society would be now moved into this banking center that would be the heart of a world empire. And he ran a commission over who discovered the calculus that he himself chaired. And despite having no evidence that he discovered it before Leibniz, and all evidence showcasing that he or his handlers stole it and repackaged it from Leibniz, his commission concluded, without Leibniz's even knowing that this inquiry was happening, that Leibniz himself was the plagiarist, and that was the edict of Sir Isaac Newton. So Newton was somebody who played somewhat dirty when it came to the game of science, the battle of science, but it wasn't just that, also political economy. And just to showcase here that there is no absolute wall separating pure science and the battle over scientific ideas from the battle over political economic values and systems in the geopolitical world. Leibniz and Newton, I think it's worth comparing their political economies and identities as individuals within the world that they lived in. Now, Leibniz was the founder of the science of physical economy in so many ways through his Society and Economy essay and his essays documenting the purpose and mandate of a Prussian Academy of Sciences and Industry, which he elaborates the political economic driving force behind having a society that focuses on the cultivation of mind powers in all citizens that increase the productive powers of labor and qualitative powers of cognition. This is explained at great length within Leibniz's works. He was an advisor to many leaders of the world, including Tsar Peter the Great, whom he became a privy councillor, Sophie of Hanover, who nearly became the Queen of England, which would have made Leibniz at a time of 1710, 11, it would have made him prime minister in all likelihood, and several other leading statesmen around the world. He promoted industrial and cultural excellence as the basis of domestic and foreign policy. He taught that mathematics must serve physics and economics must serve physical needs of humanity. That is explicit in all of his works. And he fought to expel irrationalism itself from science. Newton, however, was the master, also had a political identity. He was a member of the British Parliament, although no record of anything he ever said aloud exists, except the only records in Parliament of Newton's public remarks were to open the window because it was too cold. So he didn't seem to have too much to actually say, although it was a mark of prestige to be a member of Parliament. He was a master of the bank, a master warden of the Bank of England, the world's most powerful private central bank, as soon as it was set up in 1694. And as such, he was in charge of the Recoinage Act, the destructive law that basically stole money from the people living in poverty of England as coins were clipped and turned into gold or silver and then reissued in smaller form back to the people. When those poor, starving people were caught forging money, they were given by Newton always the death penalty every time. He never let anyone off with anything but death penalty, and he enjoyed watching torture and murder of his own citizens quite exuberantly. He promoted speculation in opposition to industrial growth. He used his influence in the Bank of England to promote a policy of deregulation and of an abandonment of industrial programs, as we saw with his work in converting the National Land Bank from the into the South Sea Company, and the South Sea Company into the largest speculative bubble ever in history until that moment, the John Law bubbles, which effectively blew up in 1720, destroying the fortunes of so many and resulting in a vast controlled wealth transfer from the hands of the many into the ever few who were aware that the bubble would be popped. We've seen this done again and again. Newton was responsible for this. This was his idea of economy that he practically put into motion with various very powerful figures within the British oligarchy. He taught that physics must serve mathematics and that humanity must serve economic necessity. So in his Principia Mathematica, it's codification of mathematical descriptions of the universe, which presume that math and formula govern the behavior of physical reality. And when the mind of a human tries to discover or hypothesize a new law that may be outside of the known laws contained within places like his Principia, they must not. He actually says that to be a great scientist, one must use the law of mind that allows for no hypotheses. Hypotheses non fingo, as Newton said. So, the abandonment of the very thing that allows for discoveries was what he demanded from anybody who would be expected to be a respectable scientist. Now, at the same time as he was pushing this radical empiricism, thus crippling the power of creative reason from making discoveries for those stupid enough to follow his method, he was also a practicing alchemist. He was a numerologist, and he was a member of the Rosicrucian Invisible College that had created the Royal Academy of England after the British Civil War, as John Maynard Keynes had called him in the 1930s upon discovering his chest in Cambridge containing thousands of documents featuring his experiments and his works. He opened the chest and had a press conference and found that there was no actual science that accounted for any of the content of his Principia, his infinitesimal calculus, or his gravity. None of those things were contained in the chest. All that it was amongst the thousands and tens of thousands of pages was work on alchemy, turning minerals into, or trying to turn minerals into gold, and looking for the philosopher's stone for immortality. He was afraid of death, as well as numerology. His work on trying to calculate Kabbalistically when the end of the world would occur. These were all things that were contained. That's what he was spending his years doing. So, as Keynes called him, he said he was not the first of the modern scientists. He was actually the last of the Babylonian sorcerers. Now, Keynes himself saw himself walking in the footsteps of Newton, and saw himself in many ways, I believe, as a sorcerer. He was proud of that tradition. He saw no problem in it. And so there is something to be said there that I think also plays into the role that John Maynard Keynes played geopolitically in the years that he did live, and what he devoted himself to, which might come up later on. One of Leibniz's core allies, his closest ally, was Denis Papin. That right is a graphic, an image featuring an illustration depicting Denis Papin attempting to sail his steam-powered boat on the Weser River, sailed by fearful boatsmen and shippers in 1707. This is in England. And Denis Papin had actually been the inventor of the first steam engine. Before the days of Newcomen and Savary of England, it was actually Denis Papin who developed this and documented his discovery, showcasing its blueprint with the help of Leibniz, who was assisting him this entire time. They were born around the same time. They died around the exact same time. And in his new method of raising water by the force of fire, published in 1707, features the first designs of a steam engine that were the outgrowth of his work, his discovery earlier in 1690 of pressure cookers, and especially which made this work was his invention of the pressure valve, which allowed for the much more controlled buildup of pressure through steam to, in this case, food, but then that could be applied to a variety of other forms of work, as he even demonstrated with his steam powered boat, the first in the world, which appears to have been destroyed by Luddites who saw their jobs being taken, who were afraid that their jobs were going to be taken away. And strangely, it was while in England that Denis Papin dies a very quick and mysterious death in 1713. His discoveries disappear and quickly reappear, but now attributed to the figure of Newcomen, a Royal Society mathematician, but they're never permitted, as Denis Papin had written explicitly and Leibniz had written explicitly, they were never permitted to be applied to the productive industrialization of society. They were only permitted for the sake of moving water out of coal mines, and that was it. Papin had written to Leibniz in 1705, describing his view, his philosophy of the steam engine as not just a mechanistic thing or something to make money with. He rather said, I can assure you that the more I go forward, the more I find reason to think highly of this invention, which, in theory, may augment the powers of man to infinity. But in practice, I believe I can say without exaggeration that one man by this means will be able to do as much as 100 others can do without it. This idea that applying new technologies, especially through machines, would liberate the more and more human beings from being forced to live lives of manual labor, so that the labor of the mind could be liberated and their abilities, our abilities to shape identities and produce useful work by being creative, by being educated, cultured increasingly, where we did not have to be beasts of burden, physically toiling away in cyclical work. This would be the purpose of technological progress. And this idea was not always popular amongst those who wished to keep humanity more controlled, more stupidified, more easy to manage as human cattle, which would have been the enemies of Leibniz and of Papin. So as I said, this is an interesting aspect of the story. And though it was sabotaged, the Leibnizian tradition did continue onward. Both in the United States, Leibniz was a correspondent with John Winthrop Jr., the original founders of the Republican dynamic within the colonies in the 1680s, 1690s, and as well as he was corresponding with missionaries and leaders in China as well, over creating a political economic movement of cooperation that would revive the spirit of the Silk Road. So he was a grand strategist of the highest order, and his method was exemplified after he died by the young Benjamin Franklin, who, when one reads the writings of Ben Franklin's work on science, can see a very Leibnizian methodology in his ability to conduct hypothesis formation on a wide variety of natural phenomenon, and do so in a manner that made incredible breakthroughs from climatology, water currents, electricity, and so much more, even designing instruments that Mozart was to use later on in performing certain pieces of music. And this was tied very much, as it was with Leibniz, to Benjamin Franklin's view of a society of natural law and a science of economy founded upon the principle of human happiness. And he outlined this in some of his more famous works, like On the Necessity of a Paper Currency, On the Necessary Increase of Mankind, but many more. Lazare Carnot was a member of the Franklin group, had met Franklin on numerous occasions when Franklin was the ambassador to France, preparing the groundwork to replicate the success of the American Revolution in France, which unfortunately turned into a bloodbath run by British intelligence operations, which we alluded to in a previous lecture. But Lazare Carnot was among this group that really worked very hard, even after the revolution, the Republican Revolution had failed and France had fallen into civil war. He was working hard to revive this spirit and served as the head of the directorate, the most powerful group in the land. He was the only member of the directorate to criticize and to resist Napoleon's desire to become emperor. But despite that, his commitment and patriotism were so great, as he was the head of the Revolutionary Guard. Um, and he largely played such an indisputably important role at saving France in times of crisis through his brilliant creation and leadership of the École Polytechnique, which generated a high density of brilliant minds. He brought in analytical geometry, projective geometries into military practice and engineering, which was the driving force in his military strategy and training programs. So it was really quite something. It was like a Platonic academy in many ways, Plato's academy. And this is, again, representing the Franklin, the Leibnizian tradition. That over there is Lavoisier, whose head was cut off when the revolution turned into a bloodbath, and he was the great scientist who made certain important discoveries in the organization of the natural elements and had certain insights into such things as the conservation of energy within material domains, not within the metaphysical world. And Lazare Carnot was, again, a great admirer of the American system and had said in 1815, even after, as Napoleon had lost and he had gone into exile, he describes here how when the Americans founded a town or even a village, their first concern was always to bring a teacher, plus the necessary machines. The students of Franklin and Washington knew that to meet human physical needs, one has to cultivate the human mind. We in Europe are leaving the largest part of our society in ignorance. So again, the understanding that it is the human mind which gives value to a society, to an economy, is what is the most important this qualitative uh, aspect to the viable science of physical economy as it was understood by these great men, and something that has been lost in our modern times and was already being lost amongst the Europeans, who had unfortunately more hereditary ingrained systems of managerial control by an elite that saw this as a threat to their controls and did not encourage this quality to emerge. Lazare Carnot's son is the man who's going to play the most important role in the story. He was known as the father of thermodynamics, Nicolas Léonard Sadi Carnot, and like his father, had done pioneering work on steam engines, on the important uh, effects of having a steam powered and machine tool driven society, what that would have in liberating humankind from ignorance and systems of imperial dominance. And he died young. He died in 1832. Again, I would say a somewhat mysterious death that smells to me like poisoning. Just after the 1830 revolution had failed once again. But he had made many discoveries in the short time that he was alive. And his Carnot principle is what became the foundation of modern entropy, but through a perverted form that he would not have approved of had he been alive. Now, Carnot, Sadi Carnot, described this in the following words in his Reflections of the Motive Power of Fire, published in 1824. He describes, again, looking at heat-powered machines and their properties, how the motion of hot to cold is something calculable, that the pressure associated therewith can be harnessed to apply to carry out improved work through designing certain machines a certain way, and that free energy in a system can always increase the more you improve the quality of fuel, the quality of the design, of your machines. So important concepts that he codified and solidified as a quantitative science, but that was not bound by purely mathematical considerations. As we see here in the opening remarks within his very short but dense reflections on the motive power of fire, he says, he describes the natural universal attribute qualities that he was actually looking at when generating his ideas of the science of thermodynamics. He says, to heat also are due the vast movements which take place on the earth. It causes the agitations of the atmosphere, the ascension of the clouds, fall of rain and of meteors, the currents of water which channel the surface of the globe, and of which man has thus far employed but a small portion. Describing hydroelectric dams, that water, when in motion, when harnessed, can move turbines, create electricity, right? So he's referring here to the inevitability, the need to develop hydroelectric power dams. Even earthquakes and volcanic eruptions are the result of heat. From this immense reservoir, we may draw the moving force necessary for our purposes. Nature, in providing us with combustibles on all sides, has given us the power to produce at all times and in all places heat, and the impelling power which is the result of it. To develop this power, to appropriate it to our uses, is the object of heat engines. The study of these engines is of the greatest interest. Their importance is enormous. Their use is continually increasing, and they seem destined to produce a great revolution in the civilized world. This is just one example of the sort of machinery that Papin would have been developing and using. And he was always doing it, again, with the idea of alleviating burdens on people. He was always focused in his writings on the idea that his discoveries would end hunger, end poverty, improve the quality of life, create more just equality amongst people, to live more dignified lives with greater opportunities, and to reduce the influence of exploitative forces. It's very clear, as it is with all of these great scientists, which is why I think that it's discouraged in our modern society to actually read their original writings. Just a hypothesis. So let's see, after he dies, how the Royal Society perverts Carnot's principle. The first actor on this stage of the play is William Thomson, who becomes Lord Kelvin, and he writes a treatise called On a Universal Tendency in Nature to Dissipation of Mechanical Energy in 1852. 20 years after Carnot dies, he rediscovers, so to speak, Carnot's works and begins to co-opt a lot of Carnot's ideas and color them with his own more cynical vision of the universe. He, in fact, is the first officially to claim that the entire universe is in itself a machine, which will, by necessity, run down as a machine would over time towards an inevitable heat death. So he's the first that I could see who put out this in such explicit form, laying the groundwork for the scientific supposed law of entropy that became formed by another member of the British Royal Society named Rudolf Clausius. There were a couple of other important figures, Boltzmann, Helmholtz, who also played into this as part of the Royal Society operation, but I think Clausius is the most important of these figures, so I'll include him here. There's a photograph of Helmholtz in his later years, Rudolf Clausius in his later years. And it was in 1865 that he codified in the most concretized manner and it included mathematical language to also support his thesis that the entire universe is dying. And he writes in his beginning of entropy, the beginning of his description of entropy on his ninth memoir called On Several Convenient Forms of Fundamental Equations on the Mechanical Theory of Heat. This is the 1867 edition. where he says, if for the entire universe we conceive the same magnitude to be determined, consistently and with due regard to all circumstances, which for a single body I have called entropy, and if at the same time we introduce the other and simpler conception of energy, we may express in the following manner the fundamental laws of the universe, which correspond to the two fundamental theorems of the mechanical theory of heat, which is his presumption. These are, I should say, not, he calls them laws, but I think they would be more rightfully called his hypotheses, except as a Newtonian, he doesn't believe that one should ever have them. So he will call them laws. He says, number one, we must assume that the energy of the universe is constant. And number two, that the entropy of the universe tends to a maximum. So in his world, at the beginning, there would be low entropy, meaning a high potential for the universe to change, for singularities to occur at the very early phases, when things are perhaps more closely condensed and bumping into themselves much more as the forces are denser and the pressure is higher, right? One can see the particles bouncing around much more intensively. But as things grow and as things move, the pressure reduces. There's less singularity. There is thus higher entropy, thus less potential for change, and that increases asymptotically to the point where there is eventual total heat death. So he's assuming these things, that the energy of the universe is constant, that the universe has external limits is another assumption that is embedded directly in what he just said. And that because of that, we have to presume a space outside of the universe, which is another problem that Leibniz had earlier on with the Newtonians, that their world presumes that God has no differentiation, no reason to have selected the creation of the universe in the way that we find it. And it would make no difference if things were moved, shifted over a little to the left or a little to the right. There's no reason for things being the way they are rather than otherwise, which Leibniz says, no, that is an offense to all healthy minds attempting to discover things. The question always must be, why is this phenomenon the way it is, rather than possible alternatives? And it is by virtue of posing that great discoveries are made. And by removing that idea of intrinsic purposefulness from nature, from the natural creation, we're destroying our ability to formulate potent hypotheses that would allow us to make discoveries. So that was a big part of this dispute. And this comes back again in a repackaged manner here with Rudolf Clausius, extending the laws of the heat engine to the entirety of the universe, and thus the universe's creator. Clausius writes in 1868, the more the universe approaches this limiting condition in which the entropy is maximum, the more do the occasions of further change diminish. And supposing this condition to be at last completely attained, no further changes could evermore take place, and the universe would be in a state of unchanging. That's explicitly Clausius. He's very clear. But again, is this a universal, unquestionable law, as Sir Arthur Eddington asserted it to be? Or is this a simple hypothesis colored by the subjective cynicism and pessimism of misanthropic individuals, or projecting their negative toxicity onto the entirety of creation? Is that what's going on? I tend to lean to the latter. And as such, here again, to conceptualize, if In the Clausian version of the universe, or of entropy more generally, as a closed system, one can always imagine that if you start as, let's say, an analogous case could be a spray can. If you heat up um, an aerosol can and heat it under a fire, or within a fire, one will find that the particles of the gases in the aerosol will increase in their mobility, in their momentum. They will bounce on each other quite a bit. There will be thus um, an ever increased or a decreasing entropy as it heats and as there's more potential for change and builds up the pressure to a maximum. At the maximum point, it will explode, and all of the gas will thus be released into the broader environment in which the fire was happening. At that point, at every moment after the explosion, there is less singularities, there's less activity, and the heat dissipates as the particles fall uh, into stasis over time, and thus the entropy would be increasing as it moves to heat death. We could even watch a little video. I will splice in a little video to demonstrate this as we speak. And we could see how, in the case of the universe, this was applied in the 20th century as a model to try to account for why the entire universe is the way it is, observably, as far as redshifts are concerned, were detected using spectrometry in the 1920s, 30s by Hubble and others. There was a recognition that that galaxies are contained outside of our galaxy. And not only that, that some of them have red shifts, some have blue shifts. And one of the hypotheses that was imposed by the Royal Society, people like Arthur Eddington and others, was that these were signs specifically and only that they could only be the Doppler effect. That is the effect of the speed and velocity at which these objects were moving away from us, causing the light emitted from those galaxies to be shifted towards longer waves, towards the red side of the spectrum. Some other ones were presumed to be moving towards us and hence could be considered blue shift. Since I will be giving an entire class on the Big Bang and political ramifications of Big Bang theology, I won't say more about that. But if we hold this to be true, then it could be linearly extrapolated backwards in time to calculate a moment at which all of those galaxies would have been possibly contained within a singularity, a point mass, where all of the density of the universe, all of the energy was contained in a maximum pressure container of a point mass. And it was assumed that this point out of which an explosion erupted occurred 13.7 billion years ago, before which time there was nothing, and that the universe is expanding into, from that point of the exploded godlike aerosol can, the universe is thus expanding into nothingness. That the infinite nothingness contains the everythingness of the universe, which will eventually return back to nothingness at the point of a future calculable heat death. So that's the example of what practically these theories look like as they affect our current ideas of astrodynamics. The next figure, who I would call the high priest of entropy to enter the stage of this story, is Lord Bertrand Russell. He was a member of the high Russell family of England's aristocracy, a Cambridge apostle, a young man with expectations to be groomed to become one of the managerial elite of the British Empire. As a Cambridge apostle, as was John Maynard Keynes, he was allowed a certain type of educational experience that is not granted to non-apostles or even students from regular, normal colleges. He was the president of the Aristotle Society. He was the co-organizer with David Hilbert in 1900 of the World Conference of Mathematicians in Paris, which was a conference that was organized with the explicit intention to challenge all mathematicians in the world to try to reduce the universe to a limited amount of axioms and postulates, as was done with Euclid or with Newton earlier. That was the idea. There was 23 major problems outlined in math for scientists to work towards. And number two, for example, was prove that all axioms of arithmetic are consistent. So look for ways of interpreting consistency amongst all axioms of arithmetic ideas, even if there are none, even if there are inconsistencies because of certain false thoughts or false hypotheses that we are animated by. Ignore it. Look only for how to find a way to explain how they're all consistent with each other. Very dangerous technique of ironing out and erasing paradoxes, which is the source of human creative thought, is zeroing in on paradoxes. So that was challenge number 2 of 23. Number 6 was axiomatize all physical science. So try to take all knowable physical science and axiomatize it, make it into a renderable encyclopedia with descriptive attributes and rooted in axioms that are unquestionable, that you can only explain things according to assumptions about space, about time, about things like the parallel postulate or other core axioms that you assume are true but you do not prove because they're like gospel. The next phase of this operation was one of the most important projects that Bertrand Russell saw himself ever engaged on, which was the construction of the Principia Mathematica, co-authored with Alfred North Whitehead, who was also a Cambridge apostle who actually trained Russell. And this was authored in 3 volumes, which he gave it that title. It specifically is an homage to Isaac Newton, to revive Isaac Newton's system in the face of all of the disruptive discoveries of Madame Curie and Einstein and Max Planck and Dmitri Mendeleev that was overthrowing all of the false Newtonian ideas of linear space and time. And these discoveries were troublesome. And so to try to rehabilitate and reinforce Newton, this is what Bertrand Russell's work was with Alfred North Whitehead. And again, the title being identical to Newton's is not a coincidence. He was also a proponent of world government run by scientific managers from above and anarcho-syndicalist communes from below. Some people tend to address Bertrand Russell's political views and what he devoted his life to achieving politically as something separate from his mathematical ambitions, but they should not be seen as separate. They are directly connected. I'm going to show a few quotes on this, actually. And ironically, he's most known today as a great philosopher and Nobel Prize-winning pacifist, who yet still, troublingly enough, in 1946, argued for the dropping of nuclear bombs onto the Soviet Union in order to force the Soviets to submit to a one-world government. And it was only when the Soviet Union began to develop their own nuclear weaponry that Bertrand Russell changed his stance and began to promote pacifism instead, and specifically the program of mutual assured destruction, which he played a big role with Leo Szilard in advancing, which would be the idea of a Manichaean mathematical balance of the Cold War between the maintenance of constant technological parity and capacity to kill each other with doomsday weaponry. That became something that was advanced through the pugwash conferences of the late 50s and other venues that Bertrand Russell contaminated. Russell's credo, as a high priest of entropy, I thought was very nicely stated in his A Free Man's Worship in 1904, being a radical nihilist and atheist. That was his religion. He had a something to worship as a free thinker, and he writes of it in his 1904 essay that can be read online, where he says that man is the product of causes that had no provision of the end they were achieving. That is, that his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast depth of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievements must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. What a depressing, self-hating philosophy. And there's so much here where he not only absolutely denies a priori any presumption that anything exists of the individual after death, he speaks of the word soul, but it seems to have no actual meaning. And that we must presume that the universe and all of the achievements of humankind are but nothing, which will all inevitably lie in ruins without purpose or anything. This be the foundation of unyielding despair that we all must submit to is I think very interesting that he said it so clearly. He must have been a very sad, sick man, but he used somehow the sickness as a form of creative inspiration that drove him to a very productive and strangely long-lived life where he died at the age of 98. I should say as well, one thing I forgot to mention, within his Principia Mathematica, featured on the right is Alfred North Whitehead, the founder of a perversion of Leibniz's dynamics, Leibniz's monadology. Alfred North Whitehead developed something called panpsychism, which again features elements that are very similar to concepts developed by Gottfried Leibniz in his monadology, but devoid of moral reason. That's the difference, if people want to know, of the monism of Ernst Haeckel or a panpsychism of a Alfred North Whitehead, is the rejection of moral reason or any type of Platonic idea that assumes and can act upon self-referential thinking to analyze paradoxes, to improve the minds and morals of the individual and humanity in accord with an idea of the purposefulness embedded shaping all of creation. Those relationships, those ideas are banned from Alfred North Whitehead, who wishes to co-opt what is useful from great thinkers, but without the spirit. Within the Principia Mathematica, again published between 1910 and 1913, the effort was, or the attempt was made to reduce the universe, as was done by, or challenged by, David Hilbert and Bertrand Russell in 1900, to reduce the entire corpus of human knowledge to a limited array of axioms, right? Or unquestionable rules that we assume exist that bind all possibly empirical data that we accumulate and formulas that we build on that must be rooted in a limited array of systems. Thus, all of the human knowledge would be grounded in a limited, what is known as a theorem lattice. closed system, effectively imposing a cage of limits on the boundary conditions of what is possible for the human mind, reducing it to something similar to a computing machine. That's also very important, that Bertrand Russell sees no difference in a computer that utilizes deductive and inductive logic and a human mind, and that the model of the computer must be imposed onto well-behaved human minds that abide by the type of system of controls that he outlines in his idea of government, which in 1923, in his Prospects for Industrial Civilization, he describes as one aspect of this ideal government, saying that it must be international socialism under a one world engineering elite. Now, socialism, he says, socialism, especially international socialism, is only possible as a stable system if the population is stationary or nearly so. A slow increase might be coped with by improvements in agricultural methods, but a rapid increase must in the end reduce the whole population to penury. The white population of the world will soon cease to increase, the Asiatic races will be longer, and the Negroes still longer, before their birth rate falls sufficiently to make their numbers stable without the help of war and pestilence. I love that. Without the help of war and pestilence. Until that happens, the benefits aimed at by socialism can only be partially realized, and the less prolific races will have to defend themselves against the more prolific by methods which are disgusting, even if they are necessary. So here he's, again, outlining his lifelong racism. He was, after all, a lifelong eugenicist who believed firmly in a society rooted in a racially organized caste system. And he points out that those white races that are less prolific in their reproductive habits must defend themselves against those who are more overpopulated, who produce more babies, who are inferior in essence, by methods which are disgusting, even if they are necessary. It says a lot about what he does in life and what he is devoted to. And what type of socialism he is also devoted to, because he and the Fabian Society that he is a part of, he was a member of the Fabian Society with H.G. Wells, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, George Bernard Shaw, and so many other misanthropic anti-humanist elitists. Their idea of socialism was as the foundation of a world fascism, in fact, simply not one that was nationalistic in character, the way National Socialism turned out to be, or Mussolini's corporatist socialism had a nationalist character to it. They preferred the type of fascism that had a character that was universalist, that was shaped by shadowy, hidden elite technocrats, much more so than individual strongmen projecting power. But in reality, it was not all that different. They both saw human beings ultimately as cogs in a machine to be controlled by a master class. And how does he describe these scientific rulers? In his 1930 book, The Scientific Outlook, it's a very useful book to read, and I pulled out a small section of it where he goes into detail of what this should look like. He says that the scientific rulers will provide one kind of education for ordinary men and women, and another for those who are to become holders of scientific power. Ordinary men and women will be expected to be docile, industrious, punctual, thoughtless, and contented. Of these qualities, probably contentment will be considered the most important. In order to produce it, all the researchers of psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and biochemistry will be brought into play. All the boys and girls will learn from an early age to be what is called cooperative, i.e., to do exactly what everybody is doing. Initiative will be discouraged in these children, and insubordination without being punished will be scientifically trained out of them. That's the two types of education for the ordinary men and for the elites. For the ruling class, he says, except for the one matter of loyalty to the world state and to their own order, members of the governing class will be encouraged to be adventurous and full of initiative. It will be recognized that it is their business to improve scientific technique and to keep the manual workers contented by means of continual new amusements. The types of technologies that Bertrand Russell saw as being useful and permitted as far as what should be allowed to grow would be only those sorts of things which contribute to pacifying the minds of the masses and assist in making them more enslaved. And he goes in great depths and lengths into his description of the importance of radio, film broadcasting, television, psychotropic drugs, and the technologies associated with psychiatry more generally, and describes at length the need to utilize Jesuitical methods for the control and indoctrination of both the elite and the masses, and a mixture of Freud and B.F. Skinner's work that he believes is very important for the two aspects of controls within the feeling and manual behavioral domain of society. So again, a very disgusting character, but the fact that it's not just that these are academic thoughts or theories, he is practically organizing in the real world to make this happen. Now, there's a figure who I think is very interesting. I'll just point out that there's a man named James Burnham who, during the 1930s, was a personal lieutenant to the figure of Leon Trotsky after Trotsky had been expelled from the Soviet Union. Burnham was someone who, as a Trotskyist, worked very closely at the New School and other think tanks with people like Sidney Hook and Bachmann, other Trotskyists who were preparing for world revolution and the creation of something which had the word socialism, but looked a lot more, I believe, and when I examine it, it was much more close to what Bertrand Russell had described and the other Fabian socialists had described, as far as their ambition of keeping the workers dumb and busy and obedient, while a higher elite managed real power from the shadows. But at a certain point, just before Trotsky dies in Mexico, Burnham writes he breaks with Trotsky. Did he know that Trotsky was about to be eliminated? Since Trotsky was all used up, he had no more use. He was clearly not going to be successful in his ambitions to topple Stalin and to restore the Trotskyist power in Russia that was willing to work with the Nazis and the Japanese fascists and the Russian fascists centered in Harbin, China. It was clear that that was no longer going to work. So James Burnham, anyway, for whatever reason, chooses this moment to break with Trotsky and writes a reply to Comrade Trotsky saying, "Do you wish me to prepare a reading list, Comrade Trotsky? It would be long, ranging from the work of the brilliant mathematicians and logicians of the middle of the last century to one climax in the monumental Principia Mathematica of Russell and Whitehead, the historical turning point in modern logic, and then spreading out in many directions. One of the most fruitful represented by the scientists, mathematicians, and logicians now cooperating in the new Encyclopedia of Unified Science." He's referring to the John Dewey organized Bertrand Russell, John Dewey project to unify all science in this unification of sciences movement that later found Szilard, even Reverend Sun Myung Moon, a CIA mind control cult leader, involved in funding and overseeing and even speaking at these unification of sciences conferences. This is what funded Thomas Kuhn's volume, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, as a way to obscure the mind's ability to understand what underlies real scientific revolutions, the likes of which those like Plato or later on Kepler and Leibniz had undertaken, that would no longer be understood if you abide by Thomas Kuhn's descriptive approach to scientific revolutions as part of this movement to unify science. But again, James Burnham is talking to Trotsky, saying that he has replaced Trotsky with Bertrand Russell and the inspiration of the mathematization of the universe and of organizing society, promoted by Russell and specifically contained in his Principia Mathematica. So this is very interesting, and I think that when one reads the writings of Trotsky's view of dialectic materialism, especially in the early 20s when he was overseeing the new economy policy and the management of Russia's technological and science policies. He was sort of a commissar, a czar, managing policies of industrial and scientific relations in Russia in 1924, 25, and one can read his speeches where he is attempting to impose a very destructive new model onto science, similar to what Bertrand Russell had been doing. I don't think Trotsky was nearly as smart as Russell, but this was what he was saying, is that we must reinterpret all scientific phenomenon from the standpoint that all qualities must be assumed to be caused by an organization of quantitative ideas. Quantity drives quality. Real scientists who make discoveries understand the opposite, that it is physics that leads in the dance with math, that it is quality that leads in the dance with quantity, that one must come up with a qualitative idea before one can begin as a scientist to discover what are the mathematical ways to represent that in a formalistic fashion to be communicated to others. But what comes first is the qualitative happy idea. It resolves a paradox. So again, I think that there was a shifting of language, but not really of effect. And everything is in the effect at the end of the day when it comes to political reality. I brought up here the figure of Norbert Wiener because Norbert Wiener was a student of Bertrand Russell, and in fact, as a young child mathematical prodigy, won an award and was brought to Cambridge to be a young man in his teens, groomed as one of Bertrand Russell's special boys. And Russell always had a group of young boys that he liked to groom, as so many Cambridge apostles did and I believe still do. Norbert Wiener has become famous after 1943 for his discovery of a new field called cybernetics, as he called it, the science of control. Now, as a young student, he was inspired by the prospects of what Russell laid out in the Principia as a theoretical challenge, a model to find now a way to practically create a science that would carry out in practice what is there in the Principia in theory, which is a science of control and management. Not to say that there are not useful aspects within computer science or other system management that involves cybernetic ideas of a feedback loops to help a command and control idea of something that you manage. There's useful aspects of that. You want to get feedback into those making decisions so that they can make the best informed judgments on what to do next in managing a system. Okay, fine. However, when it becomes a religion, then you're in trouble. And here we have a problem. A religion was beginning, a religion of entropy. And Norbert Wiener was very clear in his book, 1948, called Cybernetics, where entropy and the second law of thermodynamics are fundamental foundations of his science. And he says that thermodynamics makes its appearance, a science in which time is eminently irreversible, and although the earlier stages of this science seem to represent a region of thought almost without contact with the Newtonian dynamics, the theory of conservation of energy, and the latter statistical explanation of the Carnot principle or the second law of thermodynamics, all of these have fused thermodynamics and the Newtonian dynamics into a statistical and the non-statistical aspects of the same science. So, and he goes at much greater detail in his book on the need to root and ground this second law of thermodynamics as the heart, which is a closed system of all systems. Now, another aspect of the choice of the idea, he got it by thinking about an analogy of the helmsman, of a governance of a boat, maybe a big boat, which is somewhat complex. It has many people doing a multitude of tasks. But as he makes the point, the boat works best when everybody knows their place in their specialized role, but only the executive branch, only the pilot of the ship needs to understand what the whole is doing. Only his mind needs to see what everything is, how the parts work together in the whole. No one else. And in fact, it works best when everybody thinks that their part is all they need to think about. If they don't have concerns of anything outside of their limited jurisdiction, it is the best. Local control. And only the initiated high executive priesthood could understand what everything is from whole. And he describes here that, my chief teacher and mentor was Bertrand Russell, with whom I studied mathematical logic and a good many more general matters concerning the philosophy of science and mathematics. So he's always very clear that Bertrand Russell was the inspiration that shaped his formulation of this science of cybernetics. And this science of controls of cybernetics that also had an outgrowth in the form of information theory, that everything is information, that information is like a fluid that helps manage the that can be moved through feedback loops to those making control decisions and back into the thing that they control, that can always be more centralized ever more, and as the system becomes more bureaucratized, more fragmented, but thus more controllable by a centralized command control center. These things began to be infested through the Cold War into both sides of the Iron Curtain. In the case of Russia, after Stalin died, Norbert Wiener's books, which had been formally banned under Stalin, they were known as a bourgeoisie corruption that atomized and that machinized human beings. They were banned. But after Stalin died, and as Khrushchev rose, the first thing done in 1955 was Khrushchev rehabilitated Norbert Wiener and began promoting the publication of Russian editions of Norbert Wiener's Cybernetics. He was also, at the same time that he began, as he gave his secret speech, that was the big de-Stalinization thrust of Russia, he began to rehabilitate all of the Trotskyist networks that had been executed during the Moscow trials and earlier. So he began to change history. What was animating Khrushchev, I don't know. But one thing was he gave a speech in 1961 to the 22nd Party Congress, where he said that it is imperative to organize wider application of cybernetics, electronic computing, and control installations in production, research work, drafting and design, planning, accounting, statistics, and management. So he mandated that the new Russia be organized scientifically through cybernetics management. In the West, this was being done at the same time by the Rand Corporation, collaborators of James Burnham. uh, people like um, Albert Wohlstetter, who was a former Trotskyist who became the lead figure in Rand Corps, was bringing in, and also just like James Burnham, Wohlstetter was also among the earliest neoconservatives. James Burnham is himself known as the father of neoconservatism. Not a coincidence that they would become radical anti-communists, managing the world anti-communist leagues through the CIA, that they would be bringing in cybernetics as this system that for the replacement of human thought to manage foreign domestic policy, the wars in Vietnam, utilizing certain cybernetic sub ideas like game theory. That this would happen is not a coincidence. It is not detached from their identity earlier on as Trotskyist international socialists. It's completely consistent, in fact. And this is what people like John F. Kennedy were trying to undo, were resisting. But the transformation of so many Trotskyists into neocons during the Cold War is not a coincidence. And I mentioned Sung Myung Moon. Well, you know, he wasn't just a CIA mind control cult leader. He was also the bankroller behind the World Anti-Communist Leagues, which became effectively the Fascist International. All of the unreconstructed Nazis and Japanese fascists and French fascists and Italian fascists that were never punished were given new assignments under the guise of anti-communism. And this became what was embedded into the corporations, the schools of the West, policymaking think tanks, Brookings Institute, and others. So it wasn't just the US and Russia. However, it was also Canada, where Pierre Elliott Trudeau, somebody who was trained in the Fabian Society's London School of Economics, who was a Fabian, also handled by certain Rhodes Scholars in Ottawa, like F.R. Scott, the founder of the Fabian Society of Canada, who was one of the dominant handlers of a younger Trudeau when he was brought into the Privy Council office in 1950, which was the central nervous system of the Canadian deep state. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, upon being installed as prime minister, carried out a major overhaul of all administrations and all forms of federal government. And he did it explicitly under cybernetics management, where he said in a Hamilton Conference speech on cybernetics and government in November 1969, "We are aware that the many techniques of cybernetics, by transforming the control, function, and manipulation of information, will transform our whole society. With this knowledge, we are wide awake, alert, capable of action. No longer are we blind, inert powers of fate." So there's a big assumption there that without cybernetics, we're just blind, inert powers of fate. All of a sudden, with cybernetics, we become godmen capable of controlling our destiny. By the we, he means, of course, only the technocratic elite initiated, not the masses who must always be inert powers to the blind to reality and shaped by the fate given to them by the godmen who these alphas wish to see themselves. And Europe, and the British Empire. On the left, we have Sir Alexander King. On the right, Aurelio Pichet. Both men founded the Club of Rome in 1968 with David Rockefeller money, managed out of also the Agnelli family that ran the Volkswagen Foundation, which Pichet was a leading part of, was I think the president of it. But Alexander King, before setting up the Club of Rome, had been the director of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in the 1950s, where he was instrumental in reorganizing all government departments of Europe, including in education, especially in education, around cybernetics new management. You increase the bureaucracies, you install a highly centralized system governing those bureaucratic systems where everybody within those bureaucracies is conditioned to become hyper specialized and myopic incapable of seeing a greater whole beyond their training. This is what he did there. He was uh, the the scientific director, the head scientific director of uh, the British Empire, I should say. That was his other job, the most powerful scientist of the British Empire, while simultaneously overseeing the overhaul of the OECD and then creating the Club of Rome as the driving think tank to shape the new religion, the new reset of world ethics around the notion of overpopulation as the dominant concern we should all have as governments and individuals. The idea of reducing our footprint on nature had to become the new ethos, defending nature from humanity, from human development, which was seen as a intrinsic negative, was the new dominant ethos. And what they did is they governed what they themselves called the neo-Malthusian revival, beginning in the late 60s with the murder of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. and the ouster of Charles de Gaulle, was a real coup d'etat on so many levels. And on the left is the first iteration by Malthus of the mathematical law of population, featuring there the arithmetic growth of food production juxtaposed with the geometric growth of human populations, which Malthus stated with enough information, we could calculate the rate at which the food would be destroyed as populations increased, putting pressure onto the system of nature, resulting in mathematically predictable, foreseeable crisis points of wars and famines that would just be part of nature, nothing to do with those elites managing wars or creating famines, nothing like that. It's just part of nature, and that the elites could use this formula to act preventatively on future crises by killing people now. And Malthus describes at length in his essays on population, his essay on the principle of population in 1799, he describes those techniques that God has given mankind, the elites, to use to control populations. And he says we have to use famines, we have to use war, we have to encourage the plague in order to keep populations in a natural equilibrium. The disgusting, although necessary, practices, as Bertrand Russell alluded to. The other thing to keep in mind is that Malthus denied human creative discovery as a real property of science. He allowed for a certain degree of innovation, like Bertrand Russell allowed, but the actual power of human creative thought was denied because it was not mathematically expressible. So that's another part of Malthus. Now, Malthus thought that the world could only, at the maximum, sustain, according to his calculations, 1 billion people, and that by the year 1999, we would exceed 1 billion and fall into a population crisis of war and famine and collapse, according to that which was known in 1799 as he was writing. The fact was, creative discoveries do exist. Humanity is more than the sum total of the particles that make us up or our animalistic urges. And we found new resources. We made new discoveries of the laws of nature, as Benjamin Franklin and Leibniz had done, and Sadi Carnot and Lazare Carnot had done earlier. We continued that process at the best of times and applied it to allow for the increase of the productive powers of labor. So people didn't believe in Malthus by the turn of the last century. He had fallen out of favor, and there was a greater optimism about human nature and about our ability to leap over the limits to growth. But by the time of the Vietnam War, again organized by cyberneticists at Rand and Rhodes scholars like Dean Rusk, the cynicism had grown once more, and the toxicity of the cultural soil, especially amongst the young, drug addicted, sexed up baby boomers who had been fed many nihilistic theories of Sartre and Camus by those new educational systems that they had been processed into in the 1950s and 60s. All of a sudden, that cynical climate had returned sufficiently to allow for this uh, the seeds of Malthus to grow once more. And this is what happened when the Club of Rome funded their Limits to Growth report published in 1972. Again, begun in 1970 with money from Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Canadian taxpayers. And the idea was to use the new innovation of computer models to process and crunch more data than Malthus ever could, but to come to the same conclusion to calculate when the populations would peak. In this case, it was a little after the year 2000, and at which point we could begin to force depopulation policies through sterilization, famines, other things, which is what people like Henry Kissinger did as a self-professed neo-Malthusian who came into power with David Rockefeller and the Trilateral Commission, where he passed such measures as NSSM 200 in 1974, which called for the U.S. foreign policy to reject its former paradigm of assisting poor countries in technological growth and instead premise themselves on encouraging static and decreasing population levels in order to also acquire the resources under the soil of those countries targeted that would not be allowed to industrialize. So if they did, Kissinger says, they would begin to use their own resources. That's not permitted scientifically or politically because we have to stop communism. And that's really the type of low-level language. Now, the Neo-Malthusians were also exemplified by the figure of Canada's Maurice Strong, who is another David Rockefeller asset, who was a co-founding member of the Canadian Club of Rome. He was a founding member of the Prince Bernhard 1001 Nature Trust, designed to, again, provide funding for the new anarcho organizations that would spread all over the world, and especially after the early 70s. And he was known as the father of the Green New Deal. He was the one of the most important mentors to Klaus Schwab. He was a founder with Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum in 1971. Somebody who ran the World Bank and was Undersecretary of the United Nations. He did a lot. He also reorganized he was the creator of Canada's International Development Agency, SIDA, in 1968, which he oversaw and wired according to cybernetics principles to direct aid to countries that were poor based on the idea that they would acquire that aid by only engaging in building appropriate technologies that would not change nature or even their natural cultural ecosystems of poor people. So windmills were okay. Hydroelectric dams were rejected. Nuclear power was absolutely rejected, and Maurice Strong was actually the pioneer in 1979 when he headed Petro-Canada, the government control of petroleum and natural gas products in those days under Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He simultaneously oversaw the creation of the nuclear moratorium for Canada. So he was a very active individual. But at a time when he was overseeing the Rio Conference, which gave rise to the Agenda 21, that later became renamed Agenda 2030, and the Global Sustainable Development Initiatives, that's the Rio Conference of Rio de Janeiro on sustainability that he had overseen. He gave an interview right before that, the West magazine, where he mused about a meeting of the World Economic Forum leaders, where he said, what if a small group of world leaders were to conclude that the principal risk to the earth comes from the actions of the rich countries. And if the world is to survive, those rich countries would have to sign an agreement reducing their impact on the environment. Will they do it? The group's conclusion is no. The rich countries won't do it. They won't change. So, in order to save the planet, the group decides, isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? I don't think that this was necessarily a work of simple fiction, considering what Maurice Strong himself was engaged and committed to throughout his very productive life. So that's enough on the sick religion of entropy. Now let's end our lecture with something a little healthier. The last section is anti-entropy, a healthier paradigm. We talked about the political economy of the dismal science of Thomas Malthus. Let's look at an anti-Malthusian who was the advisor to Abraham Lincoln, one of the leading grand strategists of the 19th century, and the founder, in many ways, an heir to Leibniz through his advancement of a science of economy, Henry C. Carey. And he wrote a book called The Unity of Law in 1872, where he explicitly takes aim at Thomas Malthus, the Darwinians and the social Darwinians, James Mill, David Ricardo, and Ricardo's belief in the law of diminishing returns, which is not a law at all. As Carey points out, it's simply a cynical assumption that happens when you have an empire exploiting human cattle. Then diminishing returns becomes a factor, but it is not part of nature. That's basically adapting to artificial scarcity. So he wonderfully takes apart all of these dominant imperial systems masquerading as science. And he says, very optimistically in 1872, that the great nations of the earth should each and all profit by development of the powers, mental and physical, of each and every other, each and all growing in power for self-direction, as each and every other more and more obtains power for controlling and directing the great natural forces, the harmony of all international interests being as perfect and complete as we know to be that of the individuals of which nations are composed. His philosophy was that, unlike the liberal British imperial school I alluded to, or even the new emerging school around Karl Marx that presumed in intrinsic class struggles and intrinsic necessity of those with power to exploit those without power to the point of a pressure cooker that would explode in periodic revolutions. Carey presumed none of those things. He saw that all were abiding by common mistaken axioms about the nature of mind, morality, and God. And because of their common axioms, they both shared similar structural flaws that could be resolved if we introduce some higher considerations about anti-entropy, and specifically the necessary power of creative reason. So this is the harmony of interests that he describes, that just as a household should harmonize and not fight with each other for diminishing returns, and a good neighborhood harmonizes by being graceful and respectful and loving with each other in the self and thinking about the future. That's how harmonization of communities happen. That's how the harmonization within nations happen. And similarly, why should that stop at nations? Why can we not expect that whole world, the entire world of nations could not be a brotherhood in a similar manner? And this was his view also, that the entrepreneur the industrialist as well as the worker has common benefits, that there is win-win. That is the driving orientation and effect of wise policy, that a rising tide truly can lift all boats, and that more can be created, more energy can be created than which is consumed if you do things wisely, right? So in Carey's economic law, he focuses on the principle of the relationship of mind to matter. That is, that the power over nature increases in direct proportion to the understanding of nature. If we try to impose power within natural systems without having taken the time to rigorously and truly come to understand principles shaping the forces we're trying to use as power, then we will cause destruction to the system and ourselves. If we have true knowledge that we've earned, then the power becomes lawful. And as he gives as an example, when we understand in a simple fashion the laws of he says navigation, as we understand the laws of the stars, of the different relations of astronomy, our power of navigation increases. When we understand the rules of wind, we can build better sails. The wind is no longer something that hurts us, that moves us unwillingly. It becomes something, a power we can harness and direct to move out deeper into the ocean. We can use it for windmills to grind wheat or to grind grains and other work. We can, similarly, as we understand the rules shaping the behavior of fire, we can apply that. So fire becomes a servant, wind becomes a servant, right? To us as humans. So there's a relationship of mind and matter, and that the economy, our conceptions of what is value, prices, markets, when to use protective tariffs, when not to, should all be informed by those discoverable attributes of the human condition, which should also be tempered by an importance to always increase the productive powers of labor, which you increase through discoveries, you increase through the application of machine tools. And these were also just part of what Henry C. Carey devoted his life to advancing both within America, but also internationally. He had friends in Russia, around the circles of Tsar Alexander II. He had friends in Japan around the Meiji Restoration, such as Erasmus Heshine Smith, who was a close colleague and a top advisor to the Meiji government, bringing in these policies, and friends around Bismarck. So this was not just, again, theory. He was the organizer of the International Centennial Exhibition in 1876. He was the dominant organizer that made that happen and that invited delegations from around the world to study this American system, which was then what Mendeleev experienced when Mendeleev was in the United States and brought his research back to Russia, working with Sergei Witte in creating the Committee of the Protective Tariff and the organization of mining development, industrial development, rail development, similar in spirit to what we see China's Belt and Road Initiative doing in more modern times. It's really not dissimilar. And thus Thomas Malthus is wrong in everything he has to say. And again, that's Thomas Malthus with a photograph or with an image of his mathematical model. Carey writes of Malthus saying, Mr. Malthus was led to invent a law of population by means of which to relieve the rich and powerful from all responsibility for the existing state of things, giving them assurance that the poverty and wretchedness by which they were everywhere surrounded had resulted from the fact Creator had sent upon the earth large numbers of people for whom he had provided no table at which they might be allowed to eat, no materials by aid of which they might be clothed, thus furnishing the theory by aid of which subsequent writers have been enabled, as they supposed, to prove that in the British Islands, man had become a drug and population a nuisance. Again, very similar to the the line of Leibniz in opposition to Samuel Clarke on the issue of the creator and the issue of this is exactly, and people I challenge, they should read the Leibniz Clarke letters and sense it for yourself. The points of contention and what Leibniz is offended by within the Newtonian system and the flawed creation of God that created a society, a universe that that would intrinsically be animated by death and decay, and which could only come back to life under supernatural interventions to rewind the clock occasionally, maybe. So very, very similar. And just so that people don't think that it's just me as some Canadian geopolitical analyst giving my personal opinions about entropy being flawed or being a um, political tool for control. It's not just me. In fact, when you look at some of the greatest minds in recent history, they were offended to a very deep degree by the prospect that entropy was something that could be universalized. And I'm going to begin, since I spoke so much about Bertrand Russell, with the figure of Kurt Gödel, who was an Austrian scientist, a close friend of Albert Einstein. Like Einstein, was also banned from participation from the new Manhattan Project, the secret science project, which was not supposed to have moral scientists involved within it. But Kurt Gödel made an enemy with Bertrand Russell in 1931 or 32 when Gödel published a certain essay which demonstrated that there could never be such a thing as a closed system. And in his very short but dense, you have to be pretty mathematically apt to read it. I couldn't understand most of it, admittedly, but it took up the scientific world, which had been subdued by the belief that Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead had achieved the impossible and had created this incredible system, redefining the entire universe the way Newton had done. And Gödel basically says, no, actually, anytime you introduce self-referential elements within any descriptive system, you immediately demonstrate that there must be something outside of the descriptive closed system in question that is not contained within that. So there can be no, ontologically, there can be no closed model of the universe that has a limited array of axioms. It cannot be done ontologically. And man was a poet. He was an artist as well, which gave him a creative edge that many mathematicians lacked when they became too computerized in their thinking. But he took note that the universal law of entropy has major issues. And he says that, quote, the formation in geological time of the human body by the laws of physics, starting from a random distribution of elementary particles, is as unlikely as the separation of the atmosphere into its components. The complexity of the living things has to be present within the material from which they are derived, or in the laws governing their formation. Again, one of the precepts here is that whether within Darwinian mechanisms explaining the course of evolution of biological systems, or whether in the course of even presuming the flow moment to moment of entropic systems, the idea is that there's a stochastic randomness function at every given moment that is intrinsically unknowable. In the case of Darwin, there's a presumed randomness function causing mutations that, like rolling the dice and getting lucky every once in a while, will result in a new state coming into being through the tension generated by scarcity whereby a larger claw or a bigger leg or whatever might occur in a favored species that allows it to kill its enemies, have more sex, spread its genes ever more, even though Darwin didn't really know about genes, but spread its essence materially into the future. And that's all there is. Um, Gödel is just simply getting across throughout his writings that purposefulness is being ignored. You have to look at purposefulness, harmony, reason, when you're looking at why things emerge, why new systems emerge. You cannot presume that emergent systems come out of some chaos function. And how this applies to mind is interesting, since he takes note of Alan Turing, somebody who was a follower of Bertrand Russell, topographer for the British Empire during World War II, who innovated certain um, machines that he believed would eventually evolve to replace humankind. And Kurt Gödel says Turing gives an argument which is supposed to show that mental procedures cannot carry any farther than mechanical procedures. However, this argument is inconclusive because it depends on the supposition that a finite mind is capable of only a finite number of distinguishable states. What Turing disregards completely is the fact that mind in its use is not static, but constantly developing. So all of these mathematicians all presume that the mind has a natural state of homeostasis, that it naturally is in. And Kurt Gödel makes the point, no, there's constant change. And in a healthy person, that change is oriented towards perfectibility, constant development. And also, again, being a poet, he's somebody who is also able to look at the qualities of mind which are not reducible to logic alone, but have the ability to generate metaphor, to observe irony, to grapple with paradoxes and generate solution concepts in the form, again, of metaphorical ideas that are eurekas. And he's devoting his life in the last decade, 15 or so years, to rehabilitating Leibniz. And he describes as much throughout his writings. And he's actually of the view that there is a conspiracy run by Bertrand Russell to destroy the writings of Leibniz and obscure Leibniz's discoveries. And when he was asked by a friend why would they do this, he says, because certain people wish to keep the world in a state of mental enslavement. I would also add, sadly, that Kurt Gödel died in 1977 with believing that he was being poisoned, that there was an conspiracy to kill him, and would not eat food. And he was that petrified of this thing. So there is something as well, unfortunately, that is doing something disgusting to individuals who are creative. Max Planck. Go back to another example. It's not just Kurt Gödel. Max Planck, the great scientist who discovered the quantum world, the father of quantum dynamics, wrote in his Philosophy of Physics in 1935 that the second law of thermodynamics, a principle of the increase of entropy, has frequently been applied outside physics. For example, attempts have been made to apply the principle that all physical events develop in one sense only to biological evolution. A singular, unhappy attempt, so long as the term evolution is associated with the idea of progress, perfection, or improvement. The principle of entropy is such that it can only deal with probabilities, and all that it really says is that a state, improbable in itself, is followed on an average by a more probable state. Biologically interpreted, this principle points towards degeneration rather than improvement. The chaotic, the ordinary, and the common is always more probable than the harmonious, the excellent, or the rare. So it's not just me and it's not just Kurt Gödel, it's also Max Planck pointing out the problems of assuming a universalization of entropy and all of its attributes onto the universe and to life. He goes on in another part of his essay, The Philosophy of Physics, saying that as a man who has devoted his whole life to the most clear-headed science, to the study of matter, I can tell you as a result of my research about atoms this much. There is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particle of an atom to vibration and holds the most minute solar system of the atom together. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. Powerful remarks from somebody who is not just a philosopher, he is a man who has himself discovered revolutionary discoveries about creation itself. And in the formulation of his idea of the light quanta, in his writings, we find that he's using certain terminologies that have been lost to time, like harmonic oscillations. That he has an idea of harmonics within his notions of the quanta of light generated that he's looking at earlier on in the 1890s of black body radiations and the different leaps in quanta that occur when you increase the energy to heat that causes a black body to begin to get hotter, to begin to emit light. And as the light changes color from red to orange to yellow to white to blue, hot as the heat increases, there's an increasing relationship between the quality of the quanta that's being emitted by the photons that doesn't grow gradually as one might expect. There are discontinuous leaps that occur as the energy is put into the process to increase the heat. So again, these ideas that allowed him to discover the quantum, again, he worked very closely with Albert Einstein, indicate a man whose philosophy is rooted very, very deeply into the universe directly. So when he's describing his understanding that matter per se cannot be assumed to exist, he also says that space per se and time per se cannot be presumed to exist the way Newtonian might, but that behind all of this, we must presume reason, purposefulness, perfectibility. This is Leibniz, and an intelligent, conscious mind. Right? To say that God, faith, and science are incompatible is a delusional thing to say when we look at the examples of these people, who include Albert Einstein, like I said, who was a musician first, as was Max Planck, who was a concert pianist. And they would be known to play Mozart together, as would many scientists of those days when needing to unlock a creative block, a problem that was posed mathematically. And they would have recess and play around with their music and would come back with new inspired insights that would allow them to make discoveries. And it sounds esoteric, but it's not. It is very lawful. And Einstein as well made it clear that his scientific accomplishments were ephemeral to his primary concern, which is to understand the mind of God. And that's something that is recorded by one of his students. And I think a very important reminder of who science is. In the last lecture on Vernadsky, I alluded to this, but I don't think I made it explicit. Vernadsky was also the great Russian scientist, the father of Russian nuclear science, the founder of the School of Biogeochemistry, was no friend to entropy and also saw a sickness and a danger in the second law of thermodynamics. And in his Problem of Time in Contemporary Science, published in 1930, Vernadsky writes, "In one case, in 1824, the young French engineer Sadi Carnot founded thermodynamics. Carnot's principle defines the unidirectional course of a process in time. 30 years later, Rudolf Julius Clausius, then a professor at Zurich, in the principle of entropy, generalized this unidirectional process, which is expressed geometrically in spacetime by a polar vector of time, to all reality as defining the end of the world. In this form, this was an extrapolation of a logical thought, but not phenomenon of reality. So again, he's making the point that Clausius's extrapolation of Carnot's principle to extend to the end, all reality, justifying the end of the world concept, was simply a logical extrapolation. That's all it was. It was not a law. It was not real. In another writing on some fundamental problems of biogeochemistry published in 1938, Vernadsky says, due to the existence of life, the entropy of the universe should decrease in biospheric phenomenon and not increase. Clausius's entropy does not really exist. It is not a fact of being, but a mathematical expression, useful and necessary when it allows expression of natural phenomena in mathematical language. It is correct only as far as its premises are concerned. The deviation from Carnot's principle by such an essential phenomenon as living matter and its influence upon the biosphere shows that life does not stay within the premises for which entropy is stated. What does he mean here? Well, when you look at the growth over time of evidence earlier on in the geological epochs of the Precambrian, we only see evidence of very early life being very low in quantity, very low in quality as far as power of mobility, complexity, capacity to act on the environment and be influenced by said environment. Those unicellular entities are a very, you could say, high entropy. They can't do that much. And it's as you increase and move closer to our present time in the fossil records, we begin to see greater abundances of living matter at higher degrees of complexity emerging in time. This implies a direct empirical piece of evidence over 500 million years of an increase, of a decrease of entropy, not an increase, as the high priests of the universe, the dying universe, presume. So there's two approaches. Now, a cynical, absolute, cultish devotee to entropy would simply take this data and instead of seeing paradox to their thinking, as Vernadsky is trying to assist people to recognize a paradox, they would simply see this and say, "Oh, that's right. That's why. That's because the increase of life in quantity and quality, evolutionarily speaking, is causing a sucking away of energy elsewhere from the universe, and thus the more living matter exists, the more the universe itself is being accelerated to death because that energy that would otherwise be used elsewhere is being now absorbed by the living machines, so that in that world, that spin, every baby becomes an entropy machine accelerating the death of the universe. That's literally a dominant consensus opinion even today by those followers of Norbert Wiener who advance this idea that they allow for local anti-entropy or neg-entropy. They allow for that, but only under the condition that those local states of neg-entropy are sucking away energy from the rest of the universe and are accelerating ultimately the heat death of the universe. It's pathetic. And just to make it even more explicit, here's a series of variables that are not just the biodiversity and biomass, but also not just the biomass, but that also now include the biodiversity, which and sedimentary rate, continental freeboard, ice ages, cosmic ray fluxes into the Earth over the course of approximately 500 million years. This is a loose estimate, but still quite useful, which showcases through Fourier analysis certain cycles at different rates, some of which are 60 million year, others are 140 million year cycles that we see tempering these periodic cycles again, that seem to have something to do with the behavior of our solar system as it is moving. This is some of the more potent astrophysical, astroclimatological, astrobiological, biogeochemical hypotheses that are out there of the solar system's motion through our Milky Way galaxy, moving on the left side above and below every 30 or so million years, a period above and a certain period below for 30 million of years, as it goes around the galactic center every, I think, 220 million years is the estimate that I had last read. Sometimes moving through the arms, sometimes being between the arms of that Seyfert galaxy. So these are all, things to hold in mind. These are unknowns, but things that can be hypothesized with rigorously and responsibly that would account for these empirical periodicities that would also demonstrate a universe which is not dying. And I'll end here with the last figure I've chosen to use as a display of the anti-entropic school of thought of Leibniz is Lyndon LaRouche, who died in 2019 at the age of 96. And featured there is the same graph we had seen in previous lectures, featuring his model of collapse functions, the type of very simplified, but still very truthful functions at play within the collapse dynamic of the Western system that he first published publicly in 1995 as he was trying to assist his audience to understand why the current Western neoliberal banking system was destined to collapse unless certain remedial measures were undertaken. And again, featured there are three variables: monetary aggregates, the money supply, the financial aggregates, which is the speculative instruments, the derivatives, that have been growing and growing, completely detached since 1971, when this function begins, of the physical economy, the agro-industrial, technological input-output of the real world that we live in, that is animated by infrastructure, machine tools, research and science, and soft infrastructure like culture and education and hospitals. That has been permitted to atrophy, to collapse. And as such, attention is built into this bubble, not qualitatively different from the bubble ushered in by Sir Isaac Newton, who generated, with the help of others, the South Sea bubble of the early 18th century. Very similar, but this is bigger. So that's one aspect. And he's making the point, this can only be corrected when the two top curves serve the blue curve, serve physical economy, money, investment. These are all fine. They're good. But we need to have a society that understands that the money is the servant and not the master of people. I'm going to read several quotes from LaRouche that I think are appropriate as we end today's lecture. He wrote in 1998, saying closely related types of degenerative systems, closely related to both empiricist mechanics and modern statistical social theory, include the so-called information theory of Norbert Wiener and others, and the systems analysis of John von Neumann. As Wiener has stressed, the derivation of the so-called H theorem by Ludwig Boltzmann is a paradigm for both these general classes, mechanical and social, of such characteristically degenerative systems, which is entropic systems. The relevant paradox is that living systems, including any college textbook writer or lecturer, who preaches universal entropy as a dogma, are, despite themselves, characteristically anti-entropic as types of organisms. In that sense, professional honor of the positivist professor of biology depends curiously upon proving implicitly to his students that he himself does not and could not exist. The hilarious paradox that we as individuals exist because of an anti-entropic process of perfectibility in nature that generated systems after systems from simple-celled amoeba through a myriad of iterations of more complex systems to the point that human beings emerged capable of self-reflecting upon the whole process with all of these attributes of even pondering ideas of the universe and causality and creation and the soul. All of that happened through an anti-entropic process. But then these indoctrinated academics spend so much time trying to prove theoretically why the very system that allows them to be cannot be. And I just appreciated Mr. LaRouche's identification of that paradox. But he goes on. Fortunately for the existence of our species and our universe, anti-entropic processes do exist in categorically universal types. Classical science and art are filled with successful examples of such universal processes, as first argued in this way by Plato and by the founders of modern experimental physical science after him. The lawful principle underlying the ordering of our universe is characteristically anti-entropic. This includes the principles underlying the design of our solar system, as Gauss's work provides crucial experimental proof of Johannes Kepler's argument on this point. This same principle of anti-entropy is the characteristic distinction of successful economies as shown by the science of physical economy founded by Gottfried Leibniz and shown by such products of Leibniz's influence as the American system model of Alexander Hamilton, Friedrich List, Henry C. Carey, and U.S. President Abraham Lincoln. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt's economic recovery program bears this anti-entropic distinction from catastrophically failed economic policies, the latter typified by the pattern of the U.S. government's net policy changes imposed during the recent 30-odd years. So again, the realm of the battle for scientific discoveries of this nature demonstrate itself an anti-entropic attribute to the human condition, as well as the effect of those discoveries through simply realizing, as Kepler did, there is a harmonic musical set of proportions that is intelligible to the mind, not irrational, organizing, tempering the behavior of the orbits of the planets around the sun, and again in a musical way that was earlier advanced by Plato in the Timaeus through Plato's nesting or his investigation of the relationships of the five Platonic solids, and specifically the golden section, the divine proportion, which also plays a role in astronomy as it does in quantum dynamics when approached from the angle of Einstein and Max Planck. So that this is growing in the same way, parallel and directly feeding back into human economy. that there is a science of economy, a science of human happiness, which has been at the front and center of the battle over humankind. Because it requires the unification, the maturation of the species culturally, so that every individual can learn freely why their personal desires must harmonize with their higher responsibilities through will, freely, right? Not forced upon us through some Kantian moral categorical imperative, but rather something that can be awoken in every child as early on as possible, that it is a blessing to be human, but it comes with responsibilities that make us want to do good and to do the right thing and to have increased productivity without succumbing to the seductions of traps put forth by imperialists that would like to keep us more animalistic and computer-like in our thinking. And finally, the last quote by LaRouche for this relevant moment here on the science of economy. What is it? How does it work? He wrote several textbooks on it. Number one, the Science of Christian Economy, and as well as the So You Wish to Learn All About Economics, which I highly recommend people read, and which should form the backbone of any proper curriculum, are these books. But he describes that the required measurement of anti-entropy must express the characteristic function of an anti-entropic physical economic process in terms of relative increases of the human species' power over the universe per capita and per square kilometer of the Earth's surface area. Very important idea. And part of his insight into the science of physical economy was an ability to generate through what he called the LaRouche-Riemann method, a mathematical and also, but primarily physically geometric, constructive geometric science around calculating human economy from the standpoint of what boundary conditions we are generating through decisions that either increase or decrease the productive powers of labor and increase or decrease the energy flux density of the energy that we are utilizing at any given moment in society, whether a windmill or whether your society is reliant upon coal power or uranium and nuclear power. Whatever your society chooses to use as a source of fire to sustain productive systems in that society at that given moment will determine certain boundary conditions that are related very closely to how many people you have and how many potentially you could have at what standards of life expectancies, and other variables of that sort. So that set of considerations is accessible to an intelligent 9-year-old, possibly earlier. But yet, even in the more advanced university courses of economics today, this is completely unknown. And I return back to that original graph at the very beginning. Let us look now to the question of human population growth over the past 2,400 years. And we can now start seeing this as the shadow of both a political battle between oligarchical systems seeking to divide, to conquer, to enslave, to impose limits of scarcity onto the systems, both physically and metaphysically in the realm of the mind, and the opposing current represented by those followers of Plato and of St. Augustine and of Cicero and of Peter Abelard and Nicholas of Cusa and Dante and Chaucer and Shakespeare and Milton, aka Shakespeare, and Leibniz and Kepler and Gauss and Bernoulli and Riemann and Max Planck and Madame Curie and Dmitry Mendeleev and Kurt Gödel and Vladimir Vernadsky. We have an opposing current represented by something much more human, much more beautiful, that is tied to, again, the idea that we can always leap outside of, break free from our carrying capacity. We can always, that nature has created, that we are created as a part of nature, that the mind of humans is natural. It's not that there's nature and then there's the human mind, which is disruptive and unnatural and destructive when we create infrastructure. It's not that at all. It's that nature is exemplified by powers of creative expression, and that can be done self-consciously and freely by the only known species of humankind. Other species are creative without their will being involved. Humans are the creature that wills. And so the simple fact that we can release and harness common amounts of energy, but from decreasing volumes of fuel, whether it's the energy in 23.5 tons of dry wood, which is relatively equivalent to the energy of 6.15 tons of coal, which is relatively equivalent to the energy contained in 30 barrels of oil of 42 gallons each, which is relatively equivalent to the energy contained in one uranium fuel pellet, in this case weighing approximately 1.86 grams, which is equivalent in terms of calories, right? This is, we could say maybe these are not equivalent in the sense of the applied power of each in an economy. There might be differences there, but in terms of caloric power, that idea of energy, that would be equivalent to, mathematically speaking, to the energy contained in 0.57 grams of fusion fuel, which would be deuterium and tritium isotopes of hydrogen. So this each one, you cannot explain how to move from an economy that is grounded and limited by wood power into an economy that's now grounded and animated by coal or oil or uranium through some linear extrapolation. Computer would be hyper adapted to maximize perhaps behavior and productive systems in any given mode. But the thing that allows for the discontinuous leaps from one system to a higher system of potential is something that no computer could do, which is limited by deductive and inductive acts of logic. The human mind can go beyond that, and only the human mind. So this is something which, again, has been obscured, and which Kurt Gödel did a great job blowing out of the water, as did Vernadsky and others. Final quote, and now I'll end. LaRouche, in his Power of Reason in 1988, wrote, "It is the nature of the universe, a nature which must be the guidance of all sane nations and their peoples, that our universe demands, as a condition for our survival, that we pursue a vigorously anti-entropic policy of universal practice. As for the case of fire, which only mankind among all living creatures practices, through a persistent increase in the energy flux density in the principal forms of action, on which not only the progress, but the very survival of the human culture depends." And so our journey through Lecture 7 has come to an end, and I hope, dear viewer, that I have persuaded you to some degree that the God of entropy that demands fealty is not necessarily something that one must respect and pay homage to. So there was a lot there. I hope that the associated writers who made such great discoveries, who inspired me and who were featured in this presentation, inspire you as well. And I hope that this has made you want to pick up some of their original writings, which will be available in the description box under this video, for associated further deeper studies. And until then, I will leave you with those thoughts hanging over your mind, and we'll set the stage. I think this sets the stage quite well for lecture number 8, which will be on the topic of the fallacies of Big Bang cosmology and astrophysics more generally. Is the universe, how now that we've begun to sense that the universe might be animated by reason and life, not death and irrationalism, we can now look at some more concrete data and information that could really back up that story in greater detail. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll see everybody in lecture number 8 coming soon.